the duty of a responsible world power or protecting its own self-interests? China mediates peace talks in South Sudan and commits combat troops. But are there underlying motives for China's involvement? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. China may be Africa's biggest trade partner, but it has generally taken an arm's length approach to the continent's conflicts and domestic difficulties until now. China is committing 700 combat troops to South Sudan to help bring peace to the world's newest nation. And on Monday, Beijing sent its foreign minister to help mediate talks between South Sudan's warring factions. But Wang Yi rejected accusations that China has its own agenda. Speaking during talks across the border in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, he said China's mediation of South Sudan issues is completely the responsibility and duty of a responsible power and not because of China's own interests. Well, China has invested billions of dollars in South Sudan, particularly in its oil production. Around 5% of China's oil imports came from South Sudan when it was running at full production before the current conflict. China's state-owned National Petroleum Corporation has a 40% stake in South Sudan's top oil consortium, and China's biggest arms producer sold weapons worth $38 million to Salva Kiir's government last year. Fighting began in December 2013 when President Salva Kiir accused his sacked deputy, Riek Machar, of attempting a coup. Tens of thousands of people have been killed, with more than 1 million displaced. Multiple rounds of peace talks held in neighbouring Ethiopia have failed to halt the conflict, and oil-producing regions have endured some of the worst violence with output drastically reduced. A major concern, then, for the likes of China and South Sudan itself, with oil accounting for more than 90% of foreign reserves. Just some of the many points I'd like to put to our guests here on Inside Story. Let me introduce them. In London, we have Joseph Ochieno, a writer for the New African magazine and commentator on African affairs. Joining us from South Africa, from Cape Town, is Sanusha Naidu, a specialist in African international relations and the rise of emerging powers in Africa. Welcome to you both. Sanusha, if I could start with you. This is a big step back from China's policy of non-interference in foreign domestic issues, affairs. Why now?
Thanks, Nick. And I think it's very interesting that it actually comes at a point in which China is doing not necessarily a reassessment, but definitely reviewing how it's being perceived in the rest of the world. I think what is interesting about the whole debate on China and Africa is how much of Africa has influenced China. I think South Sudan is a very interesting case study of how China's policy of non-interference, however subtle it may have been, has actually shifted in gears, and to an extent in which, as you rightly pointed out, the deployment of combat troops, particularly also because China is concerned about the regional political stability in terms of what it sees as some of the outputs in terms of, you mentioned oil, but also I think in terms of oil pipelines and transportation of this oil out of the region. So it needs a stable Sudan, South Sudan in particular, that can link up to its transportation, its construction, its infrastructure priorities in Kenya as well.
So China is operating not out of altruistic reasons, but purely for its own self-interest. Is that what you say?
I'm saying that every country that comes into a foreign policy, whether it's India, China, South Korea, etc., there are vested interests, there are national interests, and those national interests have to be met. So I think in that context, China is not necessarily an exceptional state. But I think what we have to start thinking about is, with this current foreign minister's trip to Africa, we've got to ask them as well is, can they continue the usual rhetoric, or do we need to see a different rhetoric emerge?
Joseph, what's your view? Are we seeing China playing a double game here? We have them hosting these talks in Khartoum, trying to bring peace to South Sudan, while clearly backing the incumbent president by supplying him with arms.
I mean, that's extremely interesting, Nick, because as already suggested, it would be very interesting to see how this process goes, how South Sudan, whether or not it actually succeeds in South Sudan, because as indicated, this would probably be a first for China, but it would not really be a first for global powers. And I think Africa, which is probably now the new, again, center for global polity and conflicts, would like to see what China can do with this money, with this power, with this political influence, and perhaps with this military. I was, until very recently, anxious to know who would be the big players who would actually come in and try and reign on both Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, the two warring factions in South Sudan. And many a time people have actually thought about Western political leaders. Probably China would be the best guest in there because China has got a huge investment there, as you rightly suggest. But really, should Africa continue to actually look towards external forces like whether it's China or the US to try and help sort out its domestic problems? Absolutely not. But on the other hand, of course, we concur that China produces the biggest amount of money on the ground. It is, to answer your question in a very different way, whether they liked it or not, they needed to intervene because it was a quagmire after 12 months, whether they liked it or not, if they needed to get the oil out, if they needed to continue with the investments in there, for which actually at the moment they seem to be doing better than the West. The most obvious thing was for them to come in somehow, both militarily and otherwise.
So what about the flip side of this? And although China is acting primarily in its own self-interest, although they would dispute that, let's say that they are, the flip side is that their actions could actually bring peace to South Sudan, do you think?
As I say, it is difficult because it has been very, very apparent that China is on the side of the Salva Kiir government, and part of the problems that has arisen there over the last few months is that the fact that the rebels actually believe that Uganda backs Uganda backs the government. By and large, we don't know where the US are. As it happens, probably if China also comes on the side of the government side, we don't know how effective this whole process is going to be.
Okay, Sanusha, from your point of view, if China is involved in this way, do you think it's likely to precipitate an end to the conflict and therefore enable China to carry on with its economic interests in the way that it wants to?
I think, Nick, this was a new area for China, peacekeeping. Up until now, it's been very much linked to the UN process and to the AU process. But I think a few months ago, what we saw was a more direct intervention in terms of mediation. And that's very new for China. And so it'll have to basically see how it seeks to be a mediator. Also remembering that China has to deal with a region where it's also not necessarily mediating conflicts, but rather seen as an aggressor in conflicts. And I think this is something that we have to be very careful and cautious on, because we cannot assume that maybe China could end up doing perhaps or having its same lessons learned that other actors have had in the past.
Give us some other examples before you go on of where they may be perceived as being aggressors in conflicts.
Well, what I'm talking about in terms of the South China Sea issues. So this mediation process is something that China is new to in terms of how it seeks to do this in Africa. But again, there is always the question or always the caution, I think, from the Chinese perspective and from observers, is that how much will China be looking at what has been the experience of other actors external to the continent who have been engaged in conflict building, mediation, peace interventions, etc., and how successful have they been? So I think there's a little bit of an interesting development in this case where China may want to be seen as mediating, but also very cautious of what will be the kind of impact this will have, particularly taking experiences out of, say, what happened in Somalia.
But Sanusha, the thing is that, of course, China isn't exactly a dispassionate player in mediating these talks, is it?
No, not necessarily. I think China always has been one that has said that it plays an integral role to support African peace and stability. I think what is interesting now is the way in which the tactic has evolved. You know, where once it was always under a UN banner, it has always been part of an AU initiative. And so forth. I see now that they now talk about mediation. It's very interesting to see what kind of role they play in mediation. And more importantly, how will this inform inform China's policies in countries like South Sudan. So it's not dispassionate, because I don't think that its interests in Africa are very different from what the interests of other actors are in Africa, whether it's economic or political. The question really is how China's narrative continues to play on this rhetoric of being a positive sum game all the time for Africa, or always trying to look at Africa's interests and not necessarily asking the questions of its own economic interests in the continent.
Right. Joseph, what do you make of that? Some perceive China to be exploiting, but it is giving plenty back, you could argue.
No, China has substantially exploited Africa, just like the rest of the world has. In fact, China's track records, whether you take in terms of investment, so-called, so far to date, whether it's in Kenya, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Ghana, or anywhere else in Africa, it has really been massively exploitative, and it has offered substantial disadvantage to local industry. But that having been said, that track record in terms of finishing projects and offering alternative and cheaper alternatives to the West, by and large, has been much better. But when it comes to this element,
that's the point I'm making, isn't it? There is a dividend, isn't there, for say the people of South Sudan. At some point down the line, there'll be more roads, there'll be hospitals, there'll be schools, and so forth.
The problem, though, is that much as that is absolutely true, and that's credit to them, and it's been the case elsewhere. Their track records in terms of employment to Africans, the amount of jobs they offer, and in many other cases we can say that they're creating opportunities, but in many cases they actually come with many of their own employees. A case in Zambia has been in which Chinese managers have actually shot at workers who are basically asking for fair wages for their daily work. But beyond that, I think, yes, you're right. As I said, if it is the case that the Americans come in usually with their agenda, even the cool Scandinavians come to Africa with their agenda, why not Chinese? My point is, on this occasion, I think in South Sudan already, China is already seen as, if you like, a biased player. But I think where they're going to be of import and interest is that not only are they perhaps a biased player like all the rest of the other players are, but on this occasion, I think both sides in South Sudan needs them.
Would you say, Sanusha, that China's approach in Africa is very different to the way other powers get involved in the continent?
Yeah, I think what made it interesting was that it's not necessarily different. It just actually capitalized on a very important space, and that was the infrastructure space in Africa. At a time when there were not many investors in the infrastructure industry or sector in the continent, China stepped in and then started to build that up as part of its strategy. And so 15, 20 years later, when we look at China, we see a very interesting space in which they've been building infrastructure, accompanying that infrastructure with the low-cost loans, and then building social development infrastructure. Now what we see is other actors doing the same thing, whether it's South Korea, whether it's India, and even to a large extent, even the US with its US-Africa Leadership Summit last year with its project called Power Africa. So I think what is interesting is that they've come in at a time when there was a sense of a sense of whether or not the other actors or traditional actors in Africa or traditional development partners in Africa were not necessarily receptive to the needs of Africa. And I think that's what makes the engagement so interesting, coupled with the way in which it has then exploded on in terms of the media coverage it gets.
Joseph, you might say that African leaders should say, all right, China, you can come to Africa, but if you come, you're coming on our terms. But it's not straightforward, is it, for them to say that?
It is not, and here actually the guys on trial are those African leaders, in fact, and probably not the Chinese. And to be fair, perhaps to the Chinese, you'd say that they would do what they're doing, wouldn't they? Because everyone else is doing it. What are the African leaders doing? If I look back to 50 years ago when I was a 10 little boy, as I understood it, the conditionalities for countries as well as Israel, when they were coming to Uganda, if they're building a housing construction, the idea was that, well, they will come with their project managers, but the likes of the Milton of Obotes of those days would tell them that, look, we also have universities, we also have graduates. The point is, if today China is going to South Sudan and market stall traders are Chinese, you ask then what expertise are they bringing beyond their dollars. We are simply saying that yes, to date perhaps it's a message for African leaders that try and put a bit of conditionalities that you're coming on terms. You bring $50 million, you're going to get back 60, but out of the 10 that you get, one of the preconditions is that you only bring 10% of your expertise in terms of skilled workers, and out of that you're going to make sure that you create 100 high quality jobs. That is what happens when Nissan invests in the UK or in America. They don't come with Japanese cleaners, do they? Africans, I think, they need to wake up on this occasion. And on that, you don't necessarily blame China. Remember, it's a big country, a big economy with a big population. Why wouldn't they want to create jobs and opportunities for their citizens elsewhere? So on this one here, yes, the responsibility lies with us Africans. And I would like to hear what African leaders say. The problem is that many of them haven't a clue on what to say today so far. The only thing is that China offers them the alternative that the West had actually opted out of a long time ago.
Right, and on that issue, Sanusha, China's foreign minister says that Beijing will not take the path of Western colonialists. Do you think he's right?
Well, it depends what you mean by Western colonialism. I mean, Western colonialism was a very definitive way in which they engaged with the continent. It was a period in which you saw a whole exploitation. But I think, exploitation happens in many forms. One of the points that Joseph makes, I think, is right, is how do you actually ensure that you have skills development, that you have technological transfer of skills and so forth. I think that's very important. If the Chinese are very clear about the fact that they don't want to be like Africa's previous partners or traditional actors or whatever, then they can also set in motion certain ways in which they want to develop the relationship and structure the engagement. So I think to a large extent, what we want to see is both African leaders taking an important decision and step in terms of how they want to manage their engagement with China, and then of course the Chinese also can see a bit of receptiveness in that and also try and input into that. I think a key thing for this year is the China Africa Forum Summit that will be hosted in South Africa in December, and then I think will be a key benchmark to see what kind of engagement we're going to be anticipating for the next 3 years, and how is it different to what has been in the past.
I'm just wondering, Sanusha and Joseph, how you can expect countries like South Sudan to structure the engagement when it's China that has the key hand and can call the shots with fistfuls of dollars, basically.
Nick, there's no reason why South Sudan does not take control of this. It's all up to the South Sudanese leadership to say, we have the oil, we have opportunities for you to invest here in terms of those infrastructure projects. China is not offering all these other things for free. It's not free and blank check. Absolutely not. China needs the oil. China needs the minerals. China needs to create opportunities. China needs to show that it's actually global power. So it's up to the South Sudanese leadership, and indeed all the African leadership across the continent, to simply say that, well, you're coming in out of our oil, out of these other projects, you're going to do it on terms, and you're going to do it on our terms. And you know what? Before South Sudan became independent, just a few years ago, many friends in South Sudan were assuring Africans across the continent that South Sudan is going to learn from the bad lessons of the rest of Africa and do it better. We would like to see them doing better. Within 1 year of their independence, I don't think it's as good as what they promised us. So perhaps it's the best opportunity is actually for South Sudan to learn lessons elsewhere and simply actually say to Chinese or anybody else interested in their wealth and opportunities that, look, we have huge amount of opportunities here, but I'm afraid you're going to do it on our terms.
Right, okay, both. I just want to switch direction a little bit and focus on India, because India has the most troops in South Sudan out of any country. China is, in fact, next. India, too, protecting its economic interests, Sanusha?
Oh, definitely. I think what's interesting about India is that India is one of those powers that doesn't receive the kinds of media coverage and attention that China does. And no, for very obvious reasons.
Why is that?
I think India is seen as a like-minded state. It's seen as a country that conforms to some of the global standards and norms around governance, etc. It doesn't necessarily attract the attention that China does, particularly because of China's political system and so forth. And then, of course, China's role in its regional neighborhood, like in Hong Kong and Taiwan and so forth. So I think to a large extent, India is able to be a muted power in Africa, a muted presence. It continues to engage in Africa. It has a number of investment conclave meetings. It hosts a number of trade shows. It invites African governments and ministers of trade and industry to India. They involve themselves in training programs and so forth. But there has been in recent times questions about India's Africa policy. It seems to be under the previous government of Manmohan Singh, there was a bit of a kind of relaxation. There wasn't any momentum to it. And the question now is, under the new government of Modi, would we see any kind of revitalization of that engagement?
Joseph?
I don't see any difference between India and China. In fact, if anything, India, in terms of business and exploitation of Africa, perhaps they've done actually much worse than China. There is a huge cultural challenge facing these two powers, in my opinion, if they're to get the favorable coverage on the African continent. They need to, particularly their managers, they need to begin to look at African employees as workers rather than as numbers. The questions of regulations and human rights has to improve. Terms and conditions of workers on the African continent, whatever amount of money, business and opportunities they bring on the continent has to improve. Africa is no exception. We have as good workers as you'll find them anywhere else in the world. It is simply about how we're able to plan, organize and mobilize our resources and work in partnership with India and China and in partnership with the US and the rest of the world to develop our continent and our peoples and our communities and our resources.
Joseph, but if both countries are kind of equal in the way they exploit Africa, why is it that India doesn't seem to get the bad press that China does?
I think partly for the reason that has already been given, but partly because India has been around for a long time. Look at East Africa, for example. The Indians would probably know the culture of how to operate with Africans, how to sweet-talk Africans, probably how to corrupt and bribe. I'm saying this without prejudice. Africans and African leaders, and probably that's actually, not probably, but actually that's a fact. So in a way, probably Indians would probably smoother operators, and they probably, many times, probably operate behind the backs of African leaders. In fact, there's been many cases where Indian businesses are presented as fronts of local businesses. The Chinese find it slightly much more harder to do that, but it's very much the case, particularly in many of the countries, particularly within the East Africa region.
So having said all that, Sanusha, do you think India is challenging Chinese dominance on the continent?
Not necessarily. I think there's a greater sense of engagement, or rather there's a greater sense of a Chinese presence, etc. But I think the fact of the matter is that India likes the low-key profile, despite what they may intimate in terms of not being an exploitative actor in Africa. They prefer that to be something that they can get around and navigate through, because it's always good to have someone else apportion, they can take the blame than India. But I think to a large extent, there's also a question of the fact that Western powers also play a very decisive role in how they interpret both China and India in Africa, and you hear this a lot in terms of speeches, policy, rhetoric that comes out of different quarters in the West as well. And I do think that to a large extent, you have to start asking, how much has India done in Africa? Because at the moment, India's trade with Africa is not even in the same bracket as China, but they're willing to. They're very gradualist in what they see as increasing trade this year to about $100 billion US. So obviously, their role in Africa is interesting, and there have been interesting case studies about India's role in Africa's energy sector, in particular the oil market. One key thing I want to say right now is, with the oil prices currently at the levels that they are, China, and in particular India, is also beginning to see how this may affect their relationship in certain African countries. But I think the balance of payment issues comes back to Africa because of how the currency is attached to these commodities.
Okay, Joseph, just last word to you, just very briefly, if you would. Isn't it a fact that the kind of investment that countries like China and India bring to Africa is perhaps the best way to kickstart countries like South Sudan?
By and large, if well managed and actually if to worked in partnership, it would, because as I said, they're relatively cheaper, and for China particularly, a credit to them, most of their projects come on time, relatively and comparatively cheaper. My concern is the long term on whether or not Africa can continue to being just an extension of external forces for their development, whether infrastructure, economic or otherwise.
Okay, and very briefly, Sanusha, on that point.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It just depends what kind of investment, because you can have good investment and you can have bad investment. And of course, with all of investment, you also have all of the associated effects that need to be created to actually have economic development in these economies. So if these are going to be stimulus packages to kickstart these economies, yes. But again, I think the investment has to be managed from the African side.
All right. Well, that's it. We've run out of time. Very interesting discussing this with the pair of you. We do appreciate your perspective on this. Thank you very much indeed to our guests, Sanusha Naidu in Cape Town and Joseph Ochieno in London. Thanks very much indeed. And you can let us know your thoughts about this show or any other that we've done. Post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or indeed contact us on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm Nick Clark. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.